Okay, I've filmed this intro in about 17 different ways and different angles where I like pop the collar on this trench coat and I'm like, let's talk about costumes and film, but I say it like real cool, except I'm not very cool, so it just comes off really cheesy. I'll put it in the outtakes at the end, but let's talk about costume in film and how that can inspire our writing. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of this trench coat because I am literally in a trench coat in Texas in the middle of the summertime, and even though I'm inside, I'm still getting a little warm. So I'm going to go ahead and take this off, and I'll see you in the other room for the rest of this video. Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Meredith Phillips. I'm a writer, reader, and bunny mama. Today I'm continuing my series called Inspired by Film. In this series, I'm taking a look at different aspects of film and filmmaking to see how that might inspire our writing. Previous installments have included deep dives on cinematography, acting, and production design. You can find all those previous videos in the playlist that I'll link up here. I'll also, of course, link it in the description below if you want to go back and check out any of those. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at costumes and costume design. Before we jump into the film examples, I do want to give a few caveats here. The first and most important one being that I am not approaching this in terms of historical accuracy or fashion history. I am not a fashionista, as previously stated. How would you describe your fashion sense? Comfort is king.
Comfort is king.
What? It both has red in it, it matches! Secondly, I do want to make sure we acknowledge that films are in many ways fantastical, and the costumes in them are not always historically accurate. So in general, I would not recommend looking at films to get an idea of what people would have worn during a specific time period, because very often films change things to be more aesthetically pleasing to a modern day audience. For example, most recently in 2019, we had another adaptation of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and it actually won the Oscar for Best Costume Design this year. However, it has been noted in several places that the costumes in that film are not historically accurate. So while they might be good examples of costume design, they are not being recognized necessarily for their historical accuracy. I will put two other videos in the description below if you're a little more interested in that specific movie and situation. Other people have explained it much better than I could. Long story short, just make sure you're acknowledging that the film you're watching may not be historically accurate for the time period it's supposed to be portraying. If you're writing a book that takes place within the last 140 years or so, I would suggest looking up films from that time period that take place in that time period. So for example, if you're writing a story that takes place in the mid-1930s, you might take a look at a film like It Happened One Night, which came out in 1934. The film takes place in that present day, so the outfits that the characters are wearing are the current day outfits and are going to be fairly historically accurate for the time period. I can't mention It Happened One Night without talking about Claudette Colbert's wedding dress that she wears toward the end of the film. Take a look at this. Is this the most perfect wedding dress? I think it is. It's gorgeous. The other thing that you can do if you're looking for historically accurate costume inspiration for your own story is to look up not necessarily movies that are telling a story, but to look up films that were taken in that time period from the streets. Especially if you are writing a story that takes place in, say, the late 1800s or the early 1900s, there are so many cool examples of people who took cameras out to the streets, basically, and just set it up and started to film. And so you get an exact impression of the types of people that were in the city at the time, the types of clothes they were wearing, the types of accessories they might have been carrying. These are really cool ways to do some pretty quick research in terms of what costumes would be appropriate for your story. The reason that these were done, and you might be a little confused, like why are people randomly filming folks on the street? When the movie camera was first invented, people thought it was a cool thing, but they didn't really know quite what to do with it in a lot of ways. The idea of filming a story and showing that story to an audience was an idea that had to develop over time. It wasn't really the purpose behind inventing the movie camera. So in that time period in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when people were sort of figuring out what to do with this thing, they did a lot of experimenting. So there are some really interesting films that were taken that are really focused on showing how people look on film, how the movement of a dancer, for example, looks if they're being filmed. The other thing that they did is it's almost sort of a vlog style documentary. They took a movie camera and set it up on the street and just turned it on and started filming. One pretty famous example is a crew took a camera out to a factory. They set it up in front of the factory gates and they just filmed people as they were coming out of the factory after their shift at the end of the day. There's nothing that's trying to tell a story with it, but if you are writing about factory workers in the early 1900s, that could be a great way to see what did these people look like, how did they carry themselves, and all that kind of thing. These are maybe as authentic as you're gonna get because they didn't have actors that they threw in front of the camera in costumes that they had created themselves. These were real people on the street or wherever they happened to be. The other important factor here to keep in mind as you're writing your character is remember who your narrator is. If you have a narrator who loves clothing and jewelry and they're a very fashion forward type person, they're gonna know terms like chiffon or applique. If your narrator is a rough and tumble jock from the wrong side of the tracks, he's probably not gonna be using terms like gusset or empire waist to describe clothing. So let's take a look at a few films and see what we can pick out in the costumes that could be inspirational for whatever you happen to be writing. This is very similar in a lot of ways to production design. You're not going to be able to describe somebody's outfit in exact detail and put every single little thing in, but sometimes just one or two small details about what they're wearing or the cloth or the material that the outfit is made out of can convey a lot about that character. So kind of pick and choose which things you would want to point out as you're writing. Try to look for things in these examples like the colors, the patterns, the textures, and the type of material that the clothing is made out of. So let's take a look at an action adventure style film first. One of the best examples I can think of in recent times is the movie Black Panther. These costumes in this film are incredibly detailed and wonderfully crafted. Here you can see it might have been easy to make this red fabric plain and unadorned, but the designer has incorporated a zigzag design into the fabric to give it more visual interest and texture. The armor she has on her shoulders looks like it might have been inspired from armor that you might expect to find on a knight from the Middle Ages or something like that, but this is thinner and it doesn't cover her entire arm. It comes to an arrow point on one side, but the other side is a completely different style design with this sort of nested armor plates. Even her belt is not just a simple circular buckle in front, it has subtle points. Next, let's go a little bit farther back and take a look at Lord of the Rings, which has some great fantastical costumes that are obviously heavily inspired from medieval European type clothing. This movie is a great example of how to contrast sort of simple and common folk with highbrow, wealthy royalty. The hobbits are clothed throughout the series in very simple outfits. They've got muted colors, there's no patterns, and the designs are somewhat frumpy and ill-fitted. They're very baggy in a lot of ways. The cloth is utilitarian and something you would expect to find on a farmer working in the fields. When you're introduced to characters like Theoden or Boromir, their costumes are much more detailed to indicate their wealth and station. Theoden appears to be wearing a rich velvet here with gold detailing and patterns on the edges. While this is not the outfit he would wear to a royal ceremony of any sort, it is instead being worn to lead battle, and the outfit still gives indications that he is someone to be respected and followed, even if you don't know exactly who he is. Moving away from sort of the fantastical and superhero-esque costumes, let's take a look at a very creepy horror film example from 1922. We're back to German Expressionism with Nosferatu. Most of the costumes here are not anything in particular that I think need to be noted, but one of the things that makes Nosferatu, or as he is known in this film, Count Orlok, extra creepy is the long black coat and the black pants that he wears throughout the film. The clothes are nothing in particular that are special. It's really a very plain kind of outfit. However, when he is shot in those films against a dark backdrop, it almost blends in completely with the backdrop, and it makes his pale face and pale hands stand out in sharp contrast. And in a lot of frames, it really almost looks like his head and hands are sort of floating in midair, which gives it an even more creepy effect. So consider too what the lack of clothing description for your characters might do. If you love vampires and you've never watched the original sort of vampire film, I highly suggest this one. It is a miracle that we even have this film. It was not supposed to be an exact adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which had come out decades before. So they tried to change some things in the film, like they named him Count Orlok instead of Dracula, and they changed some other elements of the story. But unfortunately, when the film came out, the production company was sued by Bram Stoker's descendants, and they actually won. And the German film company who made the film was ordered to destroy all the copies of this film, which is horrifying. But thankfully there were a couple copies of the film that survived, and that's why we have it today. So check it out because it is truly a miracle. Last, let's take a look at a couple costumes from 1982's Blade Runner. This is a great film if you're writing sci-fi, obviously, or even if you're writing something futuristic or fantastical in nature. I love the huge variety of costumes that go on in this film, especially and even including the background characters. Take for example this group. There is so much to pick out here. First, why use a regular cowboy hat when it could be bright red metallic? I love the sheen on the silver coat the one guy's wearing and the buttons that adorn his collar. Is it flare? Not sure, but it adds shape and texture to the look. In this shot, the traditional Asian conical hat is slightly smaller in size on the middle character, and the shape has been completely altered for the other two, but it's still recognizable. So one thing you might consider doing is taking a type of outfit or a particular piece of clothing or accessory that most people would be familiar with and putting some sort of interesting twist on it. A different color, a different pattern, a different texture, a different, slightly different shape, something like that. It's a great way to add a little bit of quirk and interest to your characters, just as long as the way you change it still fits with who they are as a character. Okay, so those are the costumes I wanted to share with you today. Are there any films that have inspired the outfits that you have your characters wearing? If so, definitely tell us about that below in the comments. Or I know the other thing that is super popular is creating Pinterest boards with costumes and all that kind of stuff. So if you have a Pinterest account or a Pinterest board that you want to share that has a whole bunch of cool ideas on it for costuming, let us know that also below in the comments. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more content from me in the future, go ahead and click the subscribe button. I post videos on Tuesdays and Fridays. You can also find me over on Instagram at Meredith Phillips Writes. Thank you so much for joining me today. Bye. Okay, got my coat. I'm looking like me. All right, here we go again. I'm still working on it, hold on. Am I the biggest loser? I'm doing great.